Happy holidays and welcome to Hamburgers and Horror, the home of meat, monsters, and murderers calling from inside the house. I'm Noah Hook, and today we're looking at the 1974 Canadian slasher flick. I'm of course talking about Black Christmas. The movie follows a group of sorority sisters during the Christmas season, as they start to receive the most disturbing phone calls I've ever heard, and get stalked within their sorority house by a mysterious killer. This movie is so important to the slasher genre. Black Christmas, along with movies like Bay of Blood, Torso, Texas Chainsaw, and other early 70s films helped to really lay the groundwork for what the slasher genre would become during its boom in the 80s. Black Christmas specifically had a ton of influence on John Carpenter's Halloween and many films that came shortly behind it. There's no definitive answer, but a lot of people consider Black Christmas to be the first full-fledged slasher film. It was directed by Bob Clark, who has brought us a wide variety of classics like Death Dream, A Christmas Story, Porky's, and of course Super Babies, Baby Geniuses too. That's quite the spread, but oddly enough this guy has partial credit for both the slasher genre and the trashy teen sex genre. The movie script was based on an old urban legend called The Babysitter, and it was updated a bit to fit the college environment by Clark and writer Roy Moore. Clark also felt that horror was making it too easy for the killer by making the victims foolish, sex-crazed idiots, and wanted these sorority girls to be clever and astute. He focused on making every character fleshed out, and it really paid off. While there is a final girl, the other characters don't just feel like cutouts waiting to be killed. Black Christmas was a hit in Canada, but after some promotional issues, it kind of flopped in the US, but it still made $4 million, which is a good amount more than its small $620,000 budget. The movie was considered purposeless and people really hated the bleak ending, but with rescreenings and home media viewing, Black Christmas was eventually relooked at. Now it's not only considered a very influential film, it's up there with some of the top horror movies of all time. It has a decent 71 and 75 on Rotten Tomatoes, but my guess is most of the negative reviews come from people who aren't exactly horror enthusiasts. But I think it's time we take a look into the Pi Kappa Sig attic for ourselves. Grab your toilet booze, folks, it's time for Black Christmas. We open on the sorority house, whose almost castle-like facade makes a wonderful setting for most of the film. Through the eyes of a creepy, heavy-breathing POV, we watch this person lurk around outside of the house and spy on its inhabitants, but it isn't long before he is climbing up a trellis into the attic. But all the attic has is this stupid horse, so he heads down to see where the party's at. While this is happening, we get to meet some of the sorority members, like Barb, played by Margot Kidder from Superman, who is getting in an argument with her mom on the phone, and tends to go a little heavy with the booze.
No, I've had a couple.
We also meet Claire, played by Lynn Griffin from Curtains, and her boyfriend Chris as he heads out. Barb, being ditched by her mom for her new boyfriend, sadly makes plans to go skiing with her friends Jess, played by Olivia Hussey from Romeo and Juliet, and Phil, played by Andrea Martin from My Big Bad Greek Wedding. Claire can't go though, as her dad is picking her up tomorrow. The phone rings and Jess answers it. She calls the women over as the caller is someone familiar to them, who they call the Moaner. His act includes a lot of vulgar obscenities, some screaming, and I see how he earned his nickname. The women range from the terrified Claire to the annoyed Barb, who tells the caller to fuck off. The caller drops his vulgar sexual voice and calmly ends the conversation.
I'm going to kill you.
Barb doesn't make much of the continuous calls, but Claire is pretty shaken up, and after being mocked by Barb, heads upstairs to pack for tomorrow. In comes Mrs. Mack, the sorority's foul-mouthed house mother and professional alcoholic. Claire gets up to her room and finds Mrs. Mack's cat, Claude, and starts packing. But she doesn't realize there's a certain first-person someone hiding in her closet. She hears some meowing coming from the closet and thinks it's Claude and gets a little too close. The man springs out and wraps the plastic dress bag around her face. And nobody can hear what's going on due to all the Christmas party commotion. So nobody sees as the killer drags Claire's body up to the attic. Most of the sisters leave as Mrs. Mack inexplicably drinks from a hollowed-out book, leaving just her, Phil, Jess, Barb, and of course Claire and the killer. The phone rings again and the nervous Phil answers, but it's just Jess's boyfriend Peter. He's been busy practicing for a piano recital and couldn't make the party, and an anxious Jess really needs to speak in person. Oh shit, she also hits his I love you with an I know. This isn't important, but Mrs. Mack brushes her teeth and rinses with some toilet booze. Mrs. Mack, do you not have a room with a lock on it or what? Why do you have so many alcohol stashes? Must be to keep Barb from getting to it. Jess knocks on Claire's door and doesn't get an answer. She's too busy rocking away while the killer sings to her. The next day we meet Claire's dad as he is waiting for his dead daughter, which is a simple scene I've always found really sad. It gets even sadder when he's randomly hit in the face with a snowball. At least he is able to get directions to the sorority house from a student. And he isn't too happy with what he sees at the house. Old lady middle fingers, pictures of boyfriends, butts. Oh, the horror. She tells him Claire is definitely at the fraternity house where a Christmas event is happening, and they agree to head over together. As Mrs. Mack is getting ready, she hears more meowing, also believing it is Claude. Mr. Harrison doesn't seem to appreciate her colorful vocabulary as she searches for him.
God damn it, Claude, you little prick!
As Mrs. Mack and Mr. Harrison leave, we pan out to his dead daughter, sad. We meet Jess's boyfriend Peter, played by Keir Dalia from 2001 A Space Odyssey, as he learns that she is pregnant. Peter is super pumped to be a daddy, but Jess says she is going to have an abortion. He gets real manipulative and tells her to leave, but also convinces her to talk tonight after his audition. Meanwhile, Mr. Harrison is getting absolutely no help from a drunk Barb and an even drunker 5-year-old. Later that day, Jess answers the phone only for it to be the moaner again. This call is less overtly sexual, with him speaking in different voices, one being referred to as Agnes and the other Billy, and from here on they are going to get creepier and creepier. Mrs. Mack gets back to the house and needs help getting inside because the front door likes to get jammed. Foreshadowing. Barb, Phil, and Mr. Harrison go to the police to report Claire as missing. Unfortunately, they are stuck with the dim-witted, quick-tempered Sergeant Nash, who is very little help to them. Barb gets back at him when he asks for the number to the sorority house, though.
Fellatio 20880. Fellatio. It's a new exchange.
Jess heads to the hockey rink to find Chris, Claire's boyfriend. She tells him she is missing and the police aren't taking it seriously. Back at the station, we meet Lieutenant Fuller, played by the incredible John Saxon from A Nightmare on Elm Street and a ton of other films, who sadly passed away in July of 2020, as he talks with Mrs. Quaife, whose 13-year-old daughter is missing. That's when Chris and Jess burst in and Chris starts yelling at Nash. Fuller comes out and apparently Chris is buddy-buddy with the lieutenant or something, and they tell him what's been going on. Meanwhile, lame-ass Peter is doing his audition or final or whatever this important recital is. He looks absolutely unhinged as these suits watch with disinterest. It clearly doesn't go well, as when we see him later, he is going ham on his poor piano. Back at the house, poor Mr. Harrison is sitting through dinner with Mrs. Mack when out of the blue a drunken Barb starts rambling on about turtle sex. It's a wonderfully strange monologue, but then it shifts into a guilt-ridden self-defense as she thinks everybody blames her for Claire's disappearance. By the end of it, even Phil is done and tells her to go to bed. This movie does a wonderful job of sliding from absurdly humorous to tensely awkward really well. Chris and Jess arrive, and Phil and Mr. Harrison follow them out to a search party. Mrs. Mack tells Phil she is heading to her sister's, so she may be gone before they return. The search party, being led by Fuller, is for Janice Quaife and Claire in a park the young girl usually travels through. While they are out, Peter arrives at the house. Mrs. Mack is packing with her usual gusto when her taxi arrives. The attic man sees, and oh look, the cat is actually still alive. That's nice. Of course, Mrs. Mack hears more meows and realizes they're coming from the attic. She climbs up to free her furry friend as the taxi honks. On her way up, she gets one of her stockings caught, while the killer hides behind her with a big hooked rope ready to come down. Mrs. Mack finally notices Claire's body and turns around just in time for the killer to release the hook, which grabs her and pulls her up to her death. The killer watches the taxi driver leave and throws a truly unsettling tantrum. Jess heads back to the house to meet with Peter just before the body of Janice Quaife is found, and based on the screaming, the sight is not pretty. So it can be assumed that the killer in the house is responsible, but it isn't really explained, so I kind of like the ambiguity of that. Jess answers the scariest call yet. It's the most unclear thus far, but the Agnes character seems to be angry at the Billy character, suggesting some sort of regret or conflict in the killer as he asks Jess to stop him. Jess calls for Mrs. Mack, but we know she's not going to answer. As she calls the police, we see someone creeping up behind her, but it's just Peter, who was napping upstairs as he got tired of waiting for her. Jess keeps being put on hold, but finally gets on the line with stupid Nash, who tells her to call the phone company, not making anything of the address she gives him. Luckily, Mr. Harrison was paying attention and overhears the address to catch his bullshit. Peter has no interest in Claire or the murdered girl, and keeps gaslighting and blaming Jess for his poor recital. Oh, and he is also leaving the conservatory, quitting music, and they're getting married. Bruh. Jess is like, I still have things I want to accomplish and can't drop everything. When Peter responds, she eventually breaks and tells him she simply doesn't want to marry him. He seems to accept that, but then asks about the baby. Back at the station, Nash is getting an earful for not mentioning the phone calls to Fuller, and the others head back to the house. Fuller goes to call the house when he sees the number Nash wrote down, and his buddy absolutely loses it. He asks Nash about the supposed new number.
It's a new exchange. FE. One of the girls that was in this afternoon gave it to me.
Eventually he catches on though.
I know. Something dirty, ain't it?
Back to the not-so-lovers quarrel, and Peter has gone full dick mode, resorting to name-calling and gaslighting. And eventually just straight up threatens her. He rushes out just as Fuller, Phil, and a phone technician named Graham arrive, and Fuller is immediately suspicious of Peter. Fuller goes to see Claire's room while Graham goes to set up a tap on the phone. Fuller asks some questions about Claire, but nothing the women tell him really points him in the right direction. They offer to wake up Barb, but based on her run-in with Nash, he just lets her sleep. Graham has set the tap, so when the phone rings, it'll also ring at the station. At the same time, he will be at the phone company to check the location. And as you all know, you gotta keep the perp on the line long enough for them to figure out who it is. Fuller also shows the women a car with an officer right outside the house in case they are in trouble. Fuller and Graham head out, and we can see just how useless that outside cop will be, as Peter has been lurking outside the house the entire time. Phil is very upset and certain Claire is dead. When she calms down a bit, she excuses herself to bed, leaving Jess by herself to answer any phone calls. Graham is at the phone company and has set up the phones, so they are ready to trace that call. But the killer is a little preoccupied at the moment, but I'm sure he'll be available soon. Jess hears a door creaking, and by golly, it's the attic guy, and he's taking a look at Barb. Jess runs over when she hears Barb gasping and hands her an inhaler. When she catches her breath, she tells Jess she had a nightmare about a man coming into her room. Sorry to break it to you, Barb, but that guy is literally right in your doorway. Barb passes back out, and Jess leaves her to listen to some Christmas carolers. Creepy little fuckers. The heavy breathing POV returns to Barb's room. It's the first time he introduces himself, calling himself Billy and referring to Barb as Agnes. Intercut with the singing children, Billy grabs this weird glass unicorn and brutally stabs Barb to death with it. Between the music, lighting, and strange shots of Barb's hands breaking the other figurines, it has a really strange gothic vibe that I love. A woman runs up and loads the carolers into a car and then tells Jess her phone is ringing. Dun dun dun! Billy proceeds to terrify everyone listening as Graham tries to figure out where the call is coming from. He reports what Peter said about the abortion,
Just like having a wart removed.
and abruptly hangs up. Fuller calls to tell her they couldn't trace him and they need him on the line longer. He asks if she recognized anything the caller said, but she says she didn't, she was just spooked. He asks about the multiple voices and about what was going on with Peter. Fuller gets pulled away with other cop stuff and ensures Jess they'll get him next time. The killer watches from Barb's room as Jess wakes up Phil and confesses her own Peter's suspicions. They don't want to believe Peter would do this, but they are both scared. They look outside to see the cop is still there, which helps a little. Another call comes in and their suspicions only worsen when a very distraught Peter is on the other end. His crying doesn't quite match Billy, but it isn't far off at times. While Graham traces the call, Peter begs her not to kill the baby. He hangs up before Graham can get a trace though. Jess, you just need to be more exciting to talk to. Fuller calls again and asks what Peter was talking about. She confesses she is pregnant and doesn't want the baby. She says his strange wording is because he is an emotional artist, but Fuller's suspicion gauge is at full capacity. He asks if Peter has ever been around when the calls were coming in, and she remembers he was earlier that night, meaning it couldn't be him. Fuller wants to talk to him anyway, and Jess says he is probably at the recital hall. As he heads out, he has the search party start going from house to find Claire. Phil is making an aspirin cocktail when these guys scare the shit out of her. But despite their lack of social cues, they are just a part of the search party. but they do help remind Jess that none of their doors or windows are locked. As Phil goes around locking, she goes in to check on Barb and gets got by Billy. Now that Jess is all alone, it's time for a phone call. Graham tries to trace it, and Fuller is notified while he looks over Peter's musical destruction. This multi-character monologue continues the Billy-Agnes tale, but also fleshes out what seem like two parental figures. It goes on for a while and Graham is finally able to trace it. Nash radios to Fuller that the calls are coming from 6 Belmont Street, the sorority house. Fuller tells Nash that's where the calls are going in, but Nash tells him that's where they are coming from too, meaning the caller is in the house. Fuller radios to Jennings, but of course he is dead in his car with a big slicey neck. He radios back to Nash and tells him to call Jess and calmly tell her to get out of the house and not to tell her that the guy is in there with her. I'm sure we can trust Nash with this. Jess can't find Phil when Nash calls her and he tells her to walk out of the front door. She says she is going to get Phil and Barb, and Nash tells her what's going on.
The caller is in the house.
The calls are coming from the house.
Terrified, she starts calling for her friends again, but alas, no answer. Now seems like the time to get out of the house, but Jess says nah, it's fire poker time. She heads upstairs to Barb's room and finds her friends both dead on the bed, and through the crack of the door she finds one terrifying eye staring at her, saying, "Agnes, it's me, Billy." She slams the door on him and runs, with Billy not far behind. She has trouble with that darn front door and gets snatched by Billy. She's able to get away and lock herself in the basement though. After some banging and screaming by Billy, all goes silent in the house. She heads down and sees a shadowy, creepy figure trying to look into the basement, and it's revealed to be Peter as he calls Jess and busts through the window to get inside. She tries to hide, but it doesn't take Peter long to sniff her out and approach her. Fuller finally gets to the house and runs in when he hears a scream. He and some officers break the basement door down and they find Jess in the corner, cradling a dead Peter, all but confirming he was the caller and killer. They bring Jess upstairs where she is sedated. Fuller and Chris speculate on why Peter started killing, and the doctor tells Fuller she probably won't be able to talk until tomorrow. The bodies are being taken to the morgue and news reporters have started showing up. All of the commotion causes Mr. Harrison to pass out, the doctor saying he's in shock. He and Chris carry him downstairs to get him to a hospital. Everybody heads out, including the doctor who is going to stay with her. We slowly pan over to the attic where we can hear Billy laughing and singing with Claire and Mrs. Mack. The movie ends with a slow zoom out of the house, showing Claire's barely visible face and Jess's fate left unknown as the phone starts to ring. So that's Black Christmas. It's one of the first slashers, but it's honestly still one of the creepiest. Billy is absolutely terrifying, and the fact that we never see him makes him even more so. There wasn't some convoluted murder revenge plan. It's just a depraved, sick man killing more or less at random. I think these are the scariest phone calls in movie history, and they would go on to influence so many in the future. Great voice work by Nick Mancuso, who apparently auditioned with his back to Clark to help them focus on the voice. He also recorded upside down to get some of those weird voices he did. I love it. Another important technique this movie utilized was Billy's POV shots, which would directly inspire the opening to Halloween just 4 years later. I typically am more afraid and just generally more interested when the killer doesn't have an easily understandable motive. Movies like this, or The Strangers, or Texas Chainsaw, where the victims really could have just been anybody at the wrong time, those are able to get under my skin a little bit more. We only get a little bit of insight into Billy's reasoning, and even that is pretty hard to make anything of. Obviously there's the 2006 remake that decided to spell it all out for us, but I consider those two films as separate beings. What I can take most from Billy is that he had a sister named Agnes, who he for whatever reason killed and probably molested, probably along with his parents. Whether that was recent or a while ago, he has since snapped and started killing more at random with a particular interest in women. He obviously had some sort of interest in this house as he was calling it before he even snuck inside, but I don't think that necessarily means he had to have a direct relationship with the house. At the time, cities would print these things called directories that were kind of like proto-yellow pages. They would list addresses, phone numbers, and sometimes even occupants. So Billy could have really just been calling up random numbers and decided he liked this group and he knew exactly where they lived. Honestly, that concept, along with the lack of locked doors and the wide array of issues and lack of technology, it's no wonder the 70s were so chock full of serial killers. Another interesting note is that while Black Christmas does have a final girl, she doesn't really fit the mold that later ones would. She wasn't overtly more pure than the other women in the house, even planning to get an abortion, which is still a hot button issue today, so I can't imagine how it was received in the 70s. And Black Christmas doesn't have the happy, empowering payoff that most later slashers would. It ends tragically with 7 people dead, one of whom is blamed for the murders, an 8th sedated, defenseless woman about to die, and a madman in the attic with 2 victims that still haven't been found. Despite a lot of humor in the movie, it really gets dark by the end. And it plays so well on the idea that Christmas is supposedly this safe time of year where everything is good. Meanwhile, there is a killer lurking on the outskirts, playing by nobody's rules but his own. By the end, nobody suspects that somebody else could be responsible. Peter is the most logical choice, but he's really not the scariest. The idea of your angry partner or a close friend or anyone you love trying to hurt you is obviously terrifying, and those kinds of situations happen every day. But the idea that there's someone out there that just wants to hurt you because they can is, at least in my mind, scarier. Those are the people that make the hairs on your neck stand up. I guess I'll leave you on that haunting note. I highly recommend Black Christmas if you haven't seen it. It's got a lot of the great stuff about slashers and also avoids a lot of the cheesiness of a lot of them, making it a bit scarier than most. Well, that's about it. This is my last review of 2020. Next week we'll be starting a new franchise, one of my personal favorites, Child's Play. As always, I'm Noah Hook, and thanks for watching Hamburgers and Horror. Stay safe out there. Thanks for watching my review of Black Christmas. If you enjoyed this review, please go like and subscribe so you can keep up with all of my horror reviews. If you want to support the channel further, you can follow me on Instagram, email me movies you'd like me to review, or become one of my patrons. Joining my Patreon allows you to choose and vote for movies you'd like me to cover in polls. It's the best way to get a movie you want reviewed to be chosen. Thanks y'all, happy holidays and happy new year.